Jesus said, it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. So is the Sabbath rest only for Israelites? I say no. Is it only Israelites that need a day of rest? Is it only Jewish slaves that need to rest? I mean, do we as Christians believe a person should work 7 days a week, 365 days a year? Sabbath's very practical. It's a moral law as well as a spiritual law. Jesus said, Mark 2:27, he said the Sabbath was made for man. The word there, man, is anthropos, and that means humanity. You know what else was made for man in the Garden of Eden? The woman. Do we still need women? Then we still need the sacred day of rest. And so I believe that the Sabbath it's an eternal institution. God makes this before there's sin. The ceremonial Sabbaths, and there are many of them, they all come as a result of sin. Part of God's perfect plan, the very beginning of his perfect institution, included the Sabbath day. And the reason he says man was not made for the Sabbath is because God first makes man, then he makes the Sabbath to be a blessing for man.
All right, so once again, Doug just made some pretty big claims here. Nothing new for Doug. He starts out quoting this passage. And before we get started explaining this, I can just tell you, and I can't emphasize enough, how Doug is a prime example of a typical false teacher who just takes passages completely out of context. It's common practice for him. And so he's trying to use this verse to prove that the Sabbath still stands in that not one tittle of the law will fail. And so by the end of this video, you're going to see just how unmistakably clear it is that the Bible teaches the Sabbath is a ritual law. You're going to see that this is Jesus' teaching, and in this video, you're going to see several scriptures that clearly demonstrate this. And so what Jesus is explaining in this verse and the similar passage in Matthew 5, and we'll just pull that one up for you too, is that God's moral law will never change. And he even follows up his point in the very next verse by giving the example of adultery. So he's talking about the moral law here, but we know that he's not talking about the ritual aspects of the law. And before we pull up these scripture examples, let's just take a moment to talk about the differences between moral and ritual aspects of the law, because it's important to understand the distinction. And here's a little chart for you. So the ritual aspects of the law were symbolic. These would be things like the priestly ordinances, things like festivals such as the Passover festival or the monthly new moon celebrations, which were celebrated at specific months of each year. And like we said, the rituals were symbolic in that they stood for something. They represented something. With the actual Webster's definition of a ritual being an often repeated action. So as you can see, all these things fit into that category. Yearly celebrations, monthly celebrations, routine daily, weekly, and annual priestly ordinances, such as sacrifices performed every evening at a specific time of the day, Day of Atonement performed specifically once a year. So as you can see, they were symbolic. And notice this, they are all often repeated actions in accordance with the ritual definition. And here's another one. Circumcision was a ritual law. It was the symbol of the Abrahamic covenant, and it was often repeated since it was performed specifically on the 8th day after birth for every male. And we remember that Jesus pointed out that circumcision was considered more important than the Sabbath in John chapter 7. And what does that tell you about the Sabbath? It tells you that it's a ritual law. And we're not going to review John chapter 7 in this video, but just keep that in mind. And so let's talk about moral laws now to make the clear distinction. Let's look at the characteristics of a moral law in comparison to ritual laws. First off, they are not often repeated actions. Instead, moral laws are just the opposite actually. All moral laws are continually in effect 100% of the time. 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, 365 days per year. In other words, it's never right to lie, commit adultery, kill, etc. And the other thing that all moral laws have in common is that they appear in the New Testament as a command, because we know that they are forever in effect. And with the 10 Commandments, 9 of the 10 Commandments do appear in the New Testament as a command, some of them multiple times, but not the fourth one, not the Sabbath. It's never given as a command in the New Testament. And going back to our chart here, this does make sense because the Sabbath fits perfectly with the ritual law characteristics. It's an often repeated action. It's every week for 24 hours with a beginning time, an end time, and unlike all other moral laws, which are continually in effect at all times, the Sabbath is only in effect one day a week. And just like circumcision, which was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, the Sabbath was the sign of the Mosaic covenant. So they were both symbols. And folks, the Bible just stresses this so much. The new covenant is new and different than the old covenant. The old agreement that God made with Israel when he took them out of bondage. And in Deuteronomy 5, we see that God does relate the Sabbath command to when the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. And they didn't have rest during their slavery, and hence the word remember, since he wanted them to remember that they were slaves in Egypt where they didn't have rest. And so he relates the Sabbath command to slavery in Egypt. And notice he doesn't do this with any of the other 9 commandments, and the sign of the agreement in the ancient Near East treaty documents was always placed in the center of the agreement. The Sabbath fits this category too, since the central words of the 10 Commandments are remember to keep the Sabbath. And so it's just so clear that the Sabbath is not a moral law, as the only specific command the New Testament gives regarding the Sabbath is right here, where it groups the weekly Sabbath with other ritual laws. And this is just 5 verses after where he says circumcision, which was the other sign of being an Israelite, is done away with. And folks, let's just stop and picture this. We have the Apostle Paul, who's going around the Mediterranean to all these predominantly Gentile areas and planting churches. And he never once gives a single instruction to any of these churches of how to keep the Sabbath. And remember, these are Gentile churches. They would have zero familiarity with the Mosaic law. They would have absolutely no familiarity with the Sabbath and its requirements. And there is no instruction by Paul or any other author in the New Testament about the Sabbath and how to keep it. Not a single verse, not a single line. There's no record of anyone in the New Testament getting chastised for not keeping the Sabbath. And again, we don't have a single instruction of how to keep it or to keep it. And along with circumcision, this verse says that it's been abolished. Given its tremendous importance, wouldn't you think that the supposed seal of God would have at least several instructions in the New Testament, or at least one instruction or command, or even a reference of how to observe it? And so in the clip, Doug is alluding to the idea that humanity needs a day of rest once per week, and he's saying, so the Sabbath is very practical. Well, here's the actual biblical rules for the Sabbath. And that's fine if you want to think that that's a good principle to take a day off work once per week. But as far as making it a law, which is what Doug is arguing for when he brings up this straw man argument, as far as making it a law, that is nowhere in the New Covenant. That's Old Covenant law. Then Doug brings up Mark 2:27. And remember what we said about Doug and context. They don't go together. And so it's ironic that Doug would use this passage to try and show the Sabbath is still in effect, since this section of Scripture teaches just the opposite. But that's what happens when you just read one verse and not the whole passage. But in Mark 2:27, Jesus is pointing out to the Pharisees that God instituted the Sabbath to be a blessing to man, but the Pharisees had turned it into a burden. But this isn't Jesus' main point of what he's trying to get across to them, and you're going to see that here. So backing up just a few verses here, Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees about his disciples picking heads of grain on the Sabbath, and you're going to see just how clear it is that Jesus is actually comparing the Sabbath to ritual laws and not moral laws. And Jesus always does this when he's defending his questionable Sabbath activities. And he does it 3 consecutive times just right here in this small passage. Let's start at the beginning to get the full context. And this same account also appears in Luke 6 and in Matthew 12, with the most details in the Matthew account. So we'll just look at the Matthew account since it has more details than Mark or Luke. So verses 3 through 4, Jesus compares the breaking of the Sabbath to when David and his men ate the consecrated showbread, which was by ritual law only for the priest to eat. And so here Jesus is saying, you thought picking heads of grain was bad? Well, I'm going to show you something worse. Just look at what David and his men did by violating the temple ritual law of eating the consecrated showbread, yet they were innocent. So Jesus compares the Sabbath to a ritual law of eating the showbread, which was by ritual law only for the priest to eat. And then, if that's not enough, Jesus immediately follows up his argument with another ritual law comparison. Next verse, verse 5. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? So here, Jesus is saying the priests worked in the temple on the Sabbath, and we know work was forbidden on the Sabbath. But yet Jesus says they were innocent in breaking the ritual law of the Sabbath in order to keep the other ritual law of priestly duties on the Sabbath. And then if that's still not enough, Jesus again immediately follows up this comparison with yet a third ritual law comparison when he quotes Hosea 6:6. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not a sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. And what Jesus is saying here is that he desires true love and worship, not animal sacrifices. And we know that animal sacrifices were also part of the ritual aspect of the law, not the moral law. So here, Jesus compares the Sabbath to the ritual law of animal sacrifices. Then Jesus follows up his point by saying this next verse, For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath, because the Jews knew very well who the Sabbath came from, that it came from God. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's using the Sabbath as a launch point to assert his deity. Because what Jesus is explaining here is what he always did with the Sabbath topic, and that was for them to take their eyes off the Sabbath and put their eyes on him. And that's why he says, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, the creator of the Sabbath. And the Jews knew very well that the creator of the Sabbath was God. So Jesus is asserting his deity. Jesus always used the Sabbath as a launching point to demonstrate that he is God. And so if you're an Adventist or transitioning Adventist, just keep in mind that this is a church that started on a prediction that Jesus would return to earth, and he did not. And that's going directly against Jesus' command. This is a church that started not believing in the Trinity. A church that started not believing that Jesus is God. A church that doesn't believe the Bible is verbally inspired. And a church that believes that they have an authority equal with the Bible who interprets the Bible. Folks, this is a false form of Christianity that teaches a false and fatal gospel. Seventh-day Adventist, you're going to go to hell with Bibles in your hands. You have the wrong Jesus and a false gospel. It's time to get out before it's too late.